Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and I'm here with Jorg. Um, Jorg, is there a video playing of us?
Their video playing of us.
Oh, I
I'm
was
not
just
sure.
hearing the intro music uh, from somewhere, and was just like, it
Where's this
ended here.
coming from? Huh.
Yeah, well, I don't hear it now, so we're good. But thank you all for being here. Jorg and I are pretty excited about an upcoming class that we're doing together, Truth in Tough Times, which we encourage you all to come sign up for, not just because I like people joining me when I get to hang out with Jorg, but because this class is really something we've been working on for quite a bit, and it's going to feature a host of theologians, liberation theologians from all across the globe. And Jorg did a whole series of interviews with theologians from everywhere, outside of the United States. And the goal uh, for the class is for us to start thinking about the challenges we face in the present, but do so as Christians, with more than just those American horizons in front of us. So often, when we start to think about theology and ethics and the challenges we're facing as a planet, as a species, and even as a church, uh, the things that get on the table are already narrowed. And so, hopefully, in the class, you'll not just get to get to meet leading theologians from across the globe, but begin to think with the larger body of Christ and their witness and testimony to the challenges we're facing. So I'm pretty excited about it. You are getting any thoughts you have about what we're going to be doing? Oh, Jorg, can you hear me? He's looking very, very pensive.
Trip, I think I have some technical problems here because I can hear an echo in the back. So I'm wondering. I need to log out and come back in. I'll be right back.
Okay, no problem. Well, while Jorg's disappearing and returning, much like you know, we just finished Advent, so we've been praying for the return anyway. The class is going to go over 6 weeks, and each week we're going to be looking at a different question that was posed to all of the different liberation theologians, and you'll get to encounter the interviews with each one of these scholars, and then send questions and such like, oh, why are they framing it this way? What's going on here? And hopefully in the live streams with York and I, we will help everyone get an idea of what it's like to listen, reflect, and wrestle with these theologians and their work after getting introduced to them. All right, York, how's
So
it
Trip,
going?
can you hear me now? Is it working?
Oh yeah, I can hear you great.
I don't know what was happening, but earlier I heard an echo all the time. So good to be back. Good to be with you. And I'm really excited about this forthcoming class because we're not just talking about, uh, you know, um, people who are doing and have been doing liberation theology for a long time. These are the leading figures in the field, to be sure. But really talking about what matters. We're talking about, what's going on in the world. And, as I'm a theologian, I'm always interested in the question, what's going on with theology? What's happening to religion? And the truth is, I'm somewhat worried. So I'm not coming into this sort of hooray religion, but I'm worried about all the stuff that religion is doing. But at the end of the day, I'm really also excited about where it could help and where it could actually make a difference.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and our conversation today, why religion matters now, is a bit more broad, but it comes out of a lot of conversations we've been having, and I wonder if the place to begin is for you to think about the now. So, as a theologian and ethicist, when we ask a question like, why religion matters now, what's the most pressing elements of the now part for you that are important to get on the table, before thinking about the nature and challenges facing religion.
Yeah, I often talk about religion in terms of life and death issues. So religion is not just sort of a nice little thing that you can think about on Sunday morning or whenever it suits you, but religion is what's happening, what's in a way, it's really killing people. And of course, I also want to talk about what's life giving. So it's those two things related. But what's happening now, I think religion has once again turned deadly because it is leading to various killings in various ways. Religious ideologies are often behind empires, and that's one thing. We see that, I think, in what's happening in the Middle East now. But we also see that back home, what's happening in the United States. Um, as most of your listeners know, I grew up in Germany. This is where that accent is from, right? And when I grew up in Germany, all these years, 60s, 70s, 80s, to religion did not seem to be that important. Religion was something that was, for the pious few, and something that wasn't directly related to everyday life. But
Hmm.
in the US, this is a different story. I mean, I know everybody's talking about how religion is losing followers and adherents, but the truth is, even in the United States, um, religion is extremely powerful, and I think religion becomes a problem when it joins forces with the wrong kinds of powers, which are marked by being not life-giving, being death-dealing, and then of course we talk about actual people dying, but we're also talking about lives being ruined. People being suppressed, oppressed, exploited, and all of that. And religion is part of all of it. I mean, I can go on and give examples, but I think a lot of our listeners know what we're talking about, and are also worried about that.
Hmm. When one of the things about our current context is oftentimes religion, um, the phrase gets used without any definition to it, and so often the popular definitions are essentialized by whatever the dominant expression is in anyone's particular culture, historical moment, and such. When you look at the diversity and breadth of different religious traditions and throughout different histories, how would you how does a broader framing help understand the challenges we're facing in the present?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, in the US, we oftentimes think about Christianity mostly when we say religion, but there's all kinds of expressions. And sometimes people who are frustrated with Christianity, they move on to another religion, not realizing that every religion, to some degree, is part of this life and death struggle, right? There's long histories of various religions working hand in glove with empires. Christianity, of course, is what I'm most concerned about because that's what's dominant here in this part of the world, and this is my own work that's engaging it. But I think you can really go through all the religions, and then we say there's world religions, whatever that might be. That's yet
Hmm.
another debated term. But the biggest problem with religion in general, I think, is an approach where it is assumed that if you want to be religious, you have to close your eyes and blindly believe. I think we see that in Christianity really well. To be a person of faith for a lot of people means don't think, don't use your mind, don't use your brain, don't criticize, don't even use your capacity for observation. And I think this is a real big problem. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book titled No Rising Tide, Theology, Economics, and the Future. And I'm actually arguing that this blind religion, this blind definition of religion as blind belief, has really shaped religion in a bad way because religion does not have to be that. That's the first thing. But what is now so weird is that it's even shaped other ways of life. So in this book, I'm saying economics has become that kind of blind religion also, where, and of
Hmm.
course this is what the economists were arguing at the time too. They said uh, economy now means basically belief in the market, belief in certain ideas like that a rising tide lifts all boats, belief that giving tax cuts to wealthy people are the most natural ways of dealing with the market and helping the market along. All of that is blind faith, and I think this is the problem of religion when it gets defined as blind faith without the ability to ask questions, without the ability to think, without the ability even to have a conversation, then we have a problem. Of course, religion doesn't have to be like that, but unfortunately, in many parts of the world, it takes that form. I mean, we see this in a lot of conservative Christianity in the United States. We see it in a sort of Hinduism in India. You know, Hindutva is the thing, and this predominance of a certain Hinduism that also doesn't really encourage people to think. I'd say we see this in certain forms of Zionism. Where the thing is, here's our bottom line. This is what you have to believe. Do not ask questions. Do not listen to the cries of people. And then, of course, you have a problem. This is what we're seeing these days.
Mhm. One of the things that, oh man, and I can't, you can remind me as to which book you said this, or that I've just projected it on my head, in my head of stuff Rieger pointed out to me first. But that, oftentimes when we think about religion, we abstract it from whatever the moment of history that in the sacred text, and then migrate it to another place without another time in history, without recognizing just how the structures that frame power and create openings for life, or turn towards death, when we don't notice how history's changed, the very same language or the very same ideas or the very same enacted faith ends up serving opposite roles as it did in the past. So like when we think back to the prophets in Israel, this is a time where the economic life of Israel and its relationship to other nations, and its military, and even for large amounts of it, even the political structure and stuff, were framed. The larger meaning structure was a religious one. Right. And there, the prophets are leveraging the religious tradition against idolatry, against care for, forsaking care for the widows and orphans, and these kinds of things. That the religious tradition was the larger structure of meaning that mediated life, and the prophets are critiquing religion gone awry, and that's why you have this kind of idolatrous thing, and then it migrates in the history of the West to, after the 30 Years' War and such, we get a place where the nation state does this role, and it helps organize our economic and military relations, and it helps give a space for, a kind of free market of religion, respecting religious life, and then that prophetic impulse gets directed instead of to religion that everyone shares to the state. It might have been that little book you did on like religion and empire where you pointed out, and there was a time, right? The churches learned to do that well, say even in the United States. Think of something like the social gospel movement and this kind of thing, or the civil rights movement is pointing towards the state. Like, let's take that prophetic energy and critique the domination system of the present. Like, well, who's structuring power? The state. But part of what's happened, increasingly in the present, and I think more and more people are aware of it, is that economism, or the market, has come to be the you can't imagine a world without this being our framework of meaning and relations, and it's at the top. And then religion is subservient down here in relationship to it, and so is the state even. And we can see these kind of examples. And I wonder how, like, what is it like to, like, articulate that kind of prophetic impulse when, from the prophets that you see expressed in the life of Jesus? What is it like to do it when we start to recognize just that the structure of power that demands critique on behalf of a God of life, is an economic one?
And that's something that a lot of people are learning now. I mean, in terms of religion, I would say, as a rule of thumb, the problem with religion is when it's blind faith religion. Just repeat after me. Don't think, don't open your eyes. Sometimes I even say, when you pray, it might be good to pray with your eyes open. Pay attention to what's happening around you, right? Rather than just keep your eyes closed and look towards heaven. So religion here as blind faith is the problem. There is a critical development in religion where religion is always the critique of the dominant status quo as well. And you already mentioned the prophets. This is one example. If you go through church history, there's a lot going on. I mean, we're just coming out of Christmas. I would argue, I mean, I was arguing in my little Christmas piece again this year, that the religion, the faith that is emerging there in the Christmas miracle is really a critical religion that is challenging a religious status quo. But the religious
Hmm.
status quo, of course, is always a
Yeah.
political one and an economic one. So at this point, if you look at what's happening in theology, political theology has a huge upsurge. Everybody wants to be a political theologian, which is good. Better to pay attention to politics than not to pay attention to it. But what oftentimes happens is you get these critiques of the state over and over and over again. And I've often found, and that goes down in history, even people who talk about the state too much are oftentimes overlooking the power of money. You have this in the Reformation. There's sort of all this critique of various governments and various things going on. But who's paying attention to the flow of money, right? So this is, I think, part of our American tradition too. Where in the U.S., which is a good thing. We have these political critical traditions that are always suspicious of the state, always suspicious of the government, and so on. But for some reason we haven't developed quite well enough the critique of the economy. And so what you're getting now is people now critiquing the state without critiquing the economy, which ultimately amounts to a justification or a rubber stamping of big money. And that's what we're
Hmm.
seeing, say, in a right-wing critique. There is a right-wing critique of the status quo also, right? But it usually critiques politicians, like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, rather than what's happening with the big corporations. Or maybe, once in a while they feel unhappy about, some individual rich people, but the critique is never of the flow of money and how capitalism shapes it also. So
Hmm.
that's one problem I think that we have on the right. And this is, of course, why they can now appropriate Bonhoeffer. I mean, I know you've done a lot of work on Bonhoeffer, but people need to see how the right wing is now using a critique of the government that comes via Bonhoeffer that totally misunderstands anything that Bonhoeffer's Christianity and this Christianity from below that I'm so enamored with and excited about is sort of standing for. So, in other words, by not paying attention to the big power brokers, the big flow of money, we are really not doing religion a favor. We're making things worse. So the question then is not just religion as critique, but what kind of a critique, and how do we do it in such a way that we
Hmm.
actually get to address the problems of our time and then are able to make it different. This is, of course, also the big
Yeah.
point of our upcoming class.
So, one of well, I got sent in a question for you, and I was very amused by it, and kind of am looking forward to you answering it. And it was, so is so how do actual Christian socialists respond when right wing people label someone like Kamala Harris a socialist? Like, what goes through your mind as when you're looking at just how like the label gets leveraged in the public square, be it its association with like, oh, socialist means anti-religious, and then socialism means whatever you want to call her economic policy she was running on. I don't think I would say it was an accurate application of the label. But when you're thinking as a faith leader and as a theologian, an ethicist that's involved in an actual like socialist critique of what's going on in America, what does the way that label gets leveraged reveal to you about our predicament in the present?
Well, it basically gets leveraged as everything that people don't like. So if something you don't like, you would then label it as socialist. But I mean, let's face it. Whatever you might want to label Kamala Harris, you'd have to label Jesus as a socialist, right? I mean, he cares about the common good. He heals sick people for free, right? He preaches good news to the poor. I mean, he does not preach top down, the rich are blessed in heaven. In fact, in the sermon on the fields in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, he talks about not only blessed are the poor. In Matthew, this is the one that's usually quoted. He talks about blessed are the poor in spirit. In Luke, Jesus says, blessed are the poor. Well, analyze that, right? Do away with that if you can. And if that's not enough, he continues and says, and woe to you who are rich. I mean, if that's socialism, you can say, well, then of course your Christianity is not wrong when it pushes in some of these directions. But the other problem with the socialist label is it really does not understand even the smallest thing about what socialism ultimately stands for. I mean, people think in the US these days, even people that mean well, they think socialism is the welfare state. It's universal health care, it's taking care of poor people, homeless people, and so on. Well, that's what any decent person should be doing. This is something that traditional societies were doing. They were actually taking care of their poor. They weren't condemning them as lazy
Hmm.
and all that. That's actually a modern capitalist mistake here. So in this sense, if this is what socialism is, it's just being a decent person. It's just taking care of each other, which you could see. Of course, you could say, well, Jesus is the radical. What about the Apostle Paul? Well, what does Paul say? 1 Corinthians 12, he talks about the body of Christ, how everything is related. If one member suffers, he concludes, all suffer together with it, right? And then, of course, he says, the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, the head not to the foot, that sort of stuff. This is all the sort of stuff that to me seems to be just the fabric of a decent society. I mean, it's the fabric that some people think is in the family. Well, great, then why not apply it to all of humanity? So these things, I think, don't have a whole lot of merit. The other thing about socialism that people don't quite understand is it does never socialism does not have to be totalitarian. In fact, I mean there are forms of communism that have been more top down. We know this. They're not around as much right now. But socialism, in the end, to each according to their need. We just talked about that. From each according to their abilities is not one size fits all. It's actually interested in helping people develop their own God given capacities, in helping people, not only to do decent work, but of course also to be um, rewarded for that work, to be appreciated and respected for that work. So I often say, if you really are serious about the American dream, well, a lot of people say it doesn't work anymore. Well, it doesn't, because wealth now gets appropriated by the top, and inequality is so large that we don't know where this is going. But if you really care about the American dream, where people work hard, make an effort, and then see some reward for it, that's a much more interesting way of talking about socialism. Socialism could actually get you this, and that sort of socialism is inherently democratic. Whether
Hmm.
capitalism is democratic is also a question, right? We're usually assuming capitalism is by default democratic. Well, as we see right now, it isn't. And as we'll be seeing the next couple of years, people should be waking up to this. The final thing about socialism, this is why then, people want to claim it's atheist. Socialism has always raised questions about God. So that's actually part of its legacies, but I think this is part of what's good about it. And it's not raising questions about God in terms of is there a God, yes or no, but a lot of, and there's religious socialist traditions that are part of this. The question is, who is God? What God
Hmm.
are we talking about? And there to say I'm an atheist doesn't mean I'm rejecting any and all images of God. No, it's actually saying I'm rejecting dominant images of God. I'm rejecting the theism, and of course, go back to Jesus's time, Paul. I am rejecting the theism of Caesar and the Roman Empire. Today, I am rejecting the theism preached by Christian nationalism. But therefore, in fact, I believe I have a much stronger confidence in God.
Hmm.
And I'm more excited to be a theologian than ever because I think God is real. Um, it's just that, the notion of God, the reality of God has been obscured by so many things. So then if a socialist asks some probing questions about God, we should be thanking them. We should be actually seeing what they are wondering about, and then of course see what we can up with, come up with in terms of responses. All of that to me is an open discussion, and not going there is simply trying to shut down the conversation. And of course, also in the end to shut down whatever remnants are left of democracy.
Hmm. And part of that is kind of reframing, I think, the task that a lot of religious practitioners have. where the opposite of being on their team is like getting people to their team. Where we're gonna is religion versus the atheist, or my religion versus these other religions, and it kind of in many ways appropriates the competitive domination structure of the market, and then puts it in the context of how one orients one's life. And I think part of what you're trying to invite people to see is that there's a different way of centering one's own life, and what a community, how one's community orients its faith.
If I can respond to that point, Trip, I think this is really, really crucial. Maybe the most important thing that we're talking about here. There's this false assumption that the problem of Christianity is atheism, secularism, other religions, and so on. In fact, I'm arguing that's not the problem. The fact that there are different forms of Christianity, well, that's something that goes back to the Bible, right? We have four gospels because there are differences of opinions. So the thing here, the real struggle though is Christianity against Christianity, bad faith versus good faith versus bad faith. And I think this is what we're seeing in this country. This is what we've seen under the conditions of German fascism as well. The problem here was not, are you a Christian or not, but are you a Nazi Christian or not? And most Germans, if only by default in the years between 1933 and 1945, were sort of tending towards Nazi Christianity. That is the problem. The problem of Christianity, Bonhoeffer realized, Karl Barth realized, a lot of the great theologians and church people realized that was the Confessing Church's point. The problem is false Christianity that parades around as Christianity. And of course, a lot of people think this is what Christianity is by default. It isn't. So, in this sense, then of course the same goes for any other religion. The problem is not Buddhism versus secularism, but what kind of Buddhism are we talking about? Because, a lot of people think, well, Buddhism is just a religion of peace and love. Well, it's also the religion of big business. If you look at, some Buddhism, right? Not all of Buddhism, but the Buddhism of, say, engaged Buddhists, which is a Buddhism I greatly appreciate and value, is very different than the Buddhism of imperial Buddhists or capitalist Buddhists. Those conversations we need to be having, and we don't have. In fact, there's a false solidarity that's promoted when people say, "Are you a Christian or not?" So back
Hmm.
to Kamala Harris or take Joe Biden. Whatever their beliefs are, the thing is not are they Christian or not, but what Christianity do they stand for? And I mean, I'm not the judge of that, but that's not even a conversation that anyone wants to be having. It's either, we talk about religion, or, then sort of people who are worried about this religion talk, they want to bracket religion, but thereby you're creating even more problems because you cannot that easily get rid of it.
Hmm. And part of this, I think, is the way in which religious traditions function as finished culturally, where like, oh, this is what Christianity is, or this is what Judaism is, or this is what Buddhism is. We have these kind of abstracted, essentialized versions that are compatible to whatever culture they happen to be instantiated in. And one of the things you did in your book, are looking at God and Caesar, and this is something that can be traced through the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian scriptures and other religious traditions, is that oftentimes even our sacred texts in the history of traditions, there's a battle going on in them about the very shape of religion. And so as a Christian theologian and ethicist, how does that relationship of Christianity and empire in our historical origins, how does that help frame understanding the questions of fidelity in relationship to power structures in the present?
I think that the real challenge for religion, and that's for any religion that people embrace, and of course, this is really a question of the religion that oneself embraces, right? This is not pointing fingers. The real question always is, how is it related to the powers that be? I'm a Methodist. John Wesley, at one point, maybe after a frustrated night of preaching, put in his diary the following sentence: religion must not go from the greatest to the least, or the power would appear to be of men. Religion must not go from the greatest to the least, or the power would appear to be of men. And so there's a lot of religion that is actually going from the greatest to the least. This is this whole gospel prosperity thing also, where the assumption is whoever is at the top is closer to God. And that then gets perpetuated. And of course, who is not at the top then is further away from God and can be patronized, can be exploited, can be oppressed, and so on. That I think is the fundamental problem. You see this in Jesus' own work. I mean, the thing in Jesus, of course, now people are reclaiming the fact that Jesus was Jewish, which is 100% right and important, right? So one has to understand that Jesus is operating out of the spirit and the traditions of Judaism. But that's not rubber stamping Judaism, because Jesus is actually fighting with some of his other Jewish contemporaries. Why is he fighting? Well, because there is an imperial religion, not just a Roman one, but also a Jewish imperial religion that is making life hard for the people, that is actually oppressing and exploiting people. The high priests in Jerusalem, you could say, well, there were high priests, but they were also the priests who were vetted by the Roman governor, right? Those were the kinds of religious actors that did this religion from the top down thing. And so Jesus is actually fairly critical of a lot of religion in his time, not rejecting religion but reclaiming it for something else. And I think this is part of the history. The other thing that people have to realize is, I mean, any religion is always shaped by culture, by life at one's own time. That's just the way it is. I mean, this is not good or bad, but the question is, how is it being shaped? So if you think about what people now think is conservative or traditional Christianity, what's really mind-boggling to me, especially coming from the outside of the United States, at some point, is how this sort of traditional conservative religion to me looks like America of the 1950s. So this
Mhm.
is reclaiming a certain moment in history, when women stayed home and cooked, when there were these clear, structures of what the sexes were supposed to do, what men were supposed to do, what women were supposed to do, what relationships looked like, what families looked like. This is not the history of the world forever. In fact, there are many societies where women have a very different role, where women are actually, in the leadership, where the small sort of nuclear family that now gets praised as this big religious thing in the United States is not the norm. I mean, this wasn't the norm in the days of Jesus and Paul either. Not that families didn't matter, but they were put together differently. And keep in mind, Jesus was already worried about a certain family idolatry. I have to say this because this is what a lot of people don't realize. They think, well, Christianity is all about the family. Well, what does Jesus say when his family comes to visit, right? Mark chapter 3, he looks at the people that bring him the message and say, well, who is my mother? Who are my brothers and sisters? I do not recommend people do this too often with their own mothers, but there's a certain critique there. There's a critique not just of
The ones who
dominant
know and do
religion,
the
but
will of the Father. Yeah.
also of dominant families. I mean, there's this thing, who's my family? What's the answer? Well, those who do the will of God, this is my family. So, I mean, put all of this together, and you have a really exciting not just conversation about religion, but you have lives that are lived differently, and we're missing all of this because so much of what we're doing is sort of arguing with the Christianity of the 1950s. That's not gonna sustain itself. That's not gonna be around forever.
What's fascinating to me about the kind of nostalgia for the 50s is it does not actually include the tax rates of the 1950s
Huh.
or the 30 to 1 ratio between uh, executives of a company and the worker. There are certain features. If you were like, oh, we got to go back to the 50s. Um, there's certain elements of it I'm not sure are included in that. One of
Take
the
those two. I mean, exactly. Tax
Yeah.
rates. The 1% were taxed at enormous amounts, and of course, in terms of all the other things. I mean, as you said, the differential between workers and CEOs. I've seen numbers as low as 1 to 20. A CEO salary maybe 20 times as much, but not 1,000 times as much. Now, keep in mind, if we were suggesting that today, somebody was, "Oh, that is socialism. We cannot have that." Well, guess what? It was the capitalism of the 1950s. We had it, and I think it worked actually fairly well, right? So that's yet another conversation that gets totally um, boggled when people basically assume what we have now is the way it has always been.
One of the things that I think is helpful about your framing of religion, and it actually it came to mind the other day. I was listening to an interview with Ro Khanna, who's the representative for a lot, for San Francisco, a lot of the Bay Area companies, and he makes us he I don't think he's I know he's confessionally Hindu, and in the Progressive Caucus, and one of the we probably should pay more attention to class analysis kind of things within the Democratic Party. But he made an observation. He goes, a lot of my constituents who started out with these ideals of freedom and they were techno humanists have been captured by the market. And he said, in talking to him, it's as if their imagination can't imagine an incentive structure that doesn't involve the kind of exploitation of its workers, the demand of energy. You're thinking AI and power, and then using its wealth to protect its wealth by purchasing um, representatives in the state. Like, and I was just sitting there thinking for a second. I'm like, yes, this is what theologians are supposed to do: is to point out that And he's talking about a group of people who, on a whole, would be like, I'm more of a humanist. I'm thinking about our future, and they're answering theological questions technologically. But one of the gifts I think of the kind of theological framing that a liberationist approach gives, when you don't go, oh, well, we're either theists or we're atheists or we're Christians or we're this, is going looking at how the claims for power and domination exist within our structure and calling out the idolatry. And it just comes out of the mouth of one of their representatives, and I go, yeah, and you could, in that context, you can find ways in which you can partner and have allies and flourishing and solidarity in places that don't require sameness on particular doctrines, but a shared passion for a world with more mutual flourishing in it.
It's this question of idolatry, I think, that's really central here. So it's not just, is a religion good or bad? It is the question of life giving and death dealing, but it's also, does a religion actually have an image of God or images of God that are non-idolatrous? Of
Hmm.
course, then the question is, what is idolatrous? And a lot of people don't want to go there either. But what is idolatrous? I would say is what is death dealing, what sacrifices lives to something else, what ultimately demands ultimate obedience and blind faith. Those are idolatrous images that we have to look at, and there's a lot of that going on. I
Hmm.
think maybe one of the big problems of our time is really this question of idolatry, and not realizing how it is so much part of the mainline positions. We talked about economics now a few times. Take the market. Um, there's nothing wrong with a market, where people go and exchange things. This is what Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, once envisioned: a small village economy where you have a couple of bakers, and sort of then they exchange things, and there's some profit that's being made. That's not crazy. That's not obscene. And the thing sort of feeds back into each other. What's wrong with the market is when you have these huge, too big to fail companies who then will get bailed out when they don't do well, right? This is the idolatry of the market.
Hmm.
What's wrong with the market is if people then basically explain away this huge inequality that we now see in the market, and basically assume that business is always right. Of course, what they assume is that big business is always right, which then puts pressure on all the little businesses, which are now, of course, more and more disappearing. Very few mom and pop stores are actually surviving. And this is, again, part of that idolatry of the market. A lot of it then gets then explained religiously. So, gospel of prosperity is part of this idolatry of the
Mhm.
market, assuming that whoever is highest is actually closer to God. Of course, now, take the opposite perspective. What's not idolatrous? I think there are non idolatrous ways of pursuing the market. Socialism is not necessarily against the market. But there's also non idolatrous ways of pursuing prosperity. So, prosperity is not a bad thing. People who are alarmed by the gospel of prosperity usually sort of do the knee jerk thing and say, oh, Christianity is not about prosperity. Of course it is. I mean, Jesus is all about prosperity for whom? The people, the poor, the population. So this is, well, maybe it is a socialist kind of prosperity where the inequality is not too great. That doesn't mean that there cannot be some inequality, that there cannot be some incentives for somebody who decides to work harder than somebody else. But it is the sort of thing that really puts the whole thing on its head. I mean, people realize that Jesus is actually, the widow's mite story, right? So there's the widow that donates all that she has to the temple. But in this context, Jesus also talks about how the temple, and the religious powers, and of course the economic powers related to it, are devouring the widow's properties and all of that. So in this sense, the non-idolatrous position is the one that actually supports the flourishing of life. The idolatrous one doesn't. It might proclaim it does. This is, of course, what we're told. If the rich are doing better, everybody's doing better. But we've been told that now for 40, 50 years, and we haven't seen it. So what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah, when you think of, I mean, even after the '08 collapse, which I I'm rather shocked at just how effective the market evangelists are. What was a sacrifice it demanded was a whole lot of working class people's retirement plans for bailing out um, the the banks that demanded it, and anyway, it's one of those, like, once you start to apply that kind of analysis, you can see the ways in which so much of our political and religious rhetoric is subservient to um, the incentive structure of really the 0.01% of the people. I wonder if uh, how 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 the kind of analysis you're bringing changes the way you analyze the the kind of front of mind issues where religion shows up in contemporary American consciousness, and so often it shows up around culture war issues, uh, and and the dominant framing in so many culture war issues are like, oh well, here's like a more traditional conservative one, and here's like the liberal progressive one. How does the kind of introducing a more liberation based framing, that's grounded in like the prophetic energy, um, how does it reorient the culture war challenges?
I mean, just quickly back to the economic image one more time. Anytime somebody claims something is too big to fail, you might pull out your idolatry meter and say, what's going on here? What is actually too big to fail, and why would that be? So this is one thing. Now, the culture wars here, I think, in some ways, actually function to cover up this economic idolatry. So in a way, it's not just, oh, here's an issue and there's an issue. But people that get pulled into the culture wars usually don't ask these other questions. The first question I would ask with the culture wars is, who is on what side, right? And I think in this case, of course, it's pretty clear, that the conservative sides are usually on the side of the economic status quo, which always surprised me. When you talk about conservative theology, there's a lot of good things. There's a decisiveness, there's a commitment level, there's clear notions of sin and evil. But unfortunately, sin and evil is usually finger pointing against other people, and it's never looking at sort of the sin and evil structures in which we find ourselves, where we're again devouring the widow's houses and all of that stuff, right? And shunning the orphan and the stranger. I mean, these things are
Mhm.
happening. right now. So the conservative side, no matter what one wants to argue here in terms of its cultural value or theological value, I think is really in danger of being sucked into this idolatry machine without ever noticing it. There's a German poet who once talked about the devil, that people never realize, even though he was grabbing them by the neck. Den Teufel merkt das Völklein nie und wenn er es gleich beim Kragen hätte. So this is the problem there. There's sort of the devil at work in pious looking, Christian faith based looking reality that's actually very detrimental and doesn't help the flourishing of life. On the liberal side, and I think this is the other problem, a lot of the liberal culture warriors are also not paying attention to this other economic democracy, too big to fail. And so, they might not be happy with it, but they're not fundamental questions. They'd much rather talk about, sexuality, relationships, various other issues, immigrant status and race and so on, which are tremendously important issues, don't get
Hmm.
me wrong. But to talk about these issues without how these issues, what role these issues are playing in the dominant system is also not getting to the core of it. So if your main point, if you're a church person, is to say the conservatives exclude LGBTQIA plus people, the liberals include them, well, that's great. Inclusion is better than exclusion. But usually it means inclusion into some dominant system. And one thing we know for sure about Kamala Harris, since you brought her up earlier, somebody said, "Oh, she's a socialist." No, she isn't, and neither is Joe Biden, right, or any of the other Democrats. Uh, you know, uh, or most of the other Democrats. Well, let's keep that discussion for another time. But they're all capitalists. They basically assume that capitalism is the way forward, and therefore they make the kinds of sacrifices, including human sacrifices, that capitalism requires. Keeping the minimum wages low, keeping people at work in check, making sure that the unions don't have too much power. That would be dangerous. And keep in mind, we usually think about all the Republican presidents, but the first modern president who was really pushing back against the union was the one who just died, right? Jimmy Carter was not a friend of the labor movement. Bill Clinton wasn't that helpful either. And so when actually wondering, are the liberals, and of course, now we can also talk about liberal theology, even paying attention to these broader idolatries, or are they just trying to rearrange the chairs on the Titanic?
Hmm. In so one of the questions around even the way that plays out, say in the context for those of us in an academic context, realizing the amount of social resentment towards just the way um, you know people with humanities degrees even talk about inclusion ends up creating a kind of alienation between working class people who would even value so many of the same things if it's even just phrased differently. And so the part of this shift I think that's taking place, even seen in the last election, is that even the rhetoric around inclusion and blindness to the material needs of the working class, set up for working class people that are like, if I'm being resented by the leaders in one party, um, and I don't expect my material life to be engaged in because all of these type of things are off the table. Well, then at least I can like vote my cultural resentment because I don't, I lack real political agency, right? And there's this kind of and I even heard this, since moving back and spending a lot of time with North Carolina working class people in a number of different settings where the assumption is neither party understands their material reality, but at least one of them will animate their cultural angst, right? And underneath that is like an agency deficit for for people that are being left out, um, and and then that so often this drive for inclusion among more progressive types is inclusion into a system that's already left so many of the working class out. Uh, that what do you do when no one's when the actual material needs of a growing number of people seem off the table from the electable political constituencies.
And I think this is where, especially the culture wars are even less helpful because they oftentimes get waged at some sort of elite level, middle class level, something like that, and they leave out the people. I mean, you do not really. Have these conversations in very many places. I mean, universities, of course, are a place where there these battles being waged. A lot of churches are, but at the same time, this is, of course, one of the important issues I've been paying attention to in my recent work. There's this theology in the Capitalism book I
Hmm.
just published recently, basically saying one has to see race and gender in relation to the class issue. So when then people say we're talking about the working class, well, who is the working class? Depending on how you define it, it's at least 2/3 of Americans. I would say 99% of us have to work for a living, and our jobs are by and large not getting better. So maybe we're the working class, the
Hmm.
99%. Once you realize that, you then of course have to say this is the most diverse class that ever lived. So it's not white people, black people. People think working class is white people. No, I mean all of us. Now this creates some bonds and some solidarity that is ever not addressed. It doesn't get addressed in a lot of the
Hmm.
academic discourses, and certainly not in the churches. But once you would do it, something else would happen. I mean, people think once you talk about class solidarity, you have to give up notions of gender and race. In fact, I'm arguing this is when you can actually fight racism and sexism better. Some of that is based on the history. You know, American racism goes back very early, before actual chattel slavery, 17th century, Virginia, where the basic point was white and black sharecroppers working in the field, getting too close to each other, and the masters inventing racism to make white sharecroppers feel they have more in common with the white masters than with the black slave, but the other black sharecroppers. Of course, not just ideas, but maybe you give them little privileges, but not privileges that really mean a whole lot. It's just sort of to divide them, and thereby, of course, you're now uniting white people. I call this uniting conquer, meaning you unite white people to conquer all non-white people, plus most white people who are not realizing that this identification via race, via gender, in the end, always serves the ruling class a whole lot more than other people. Now, if you don't realize that, and you now start blaming the poorest white people, who might not even have a job or maybe have all these shitty jobs, you blame the poorest white people for all this empire stuff that's going on. Of course, they don't quite get it. They cannot get it. They
Hmm.
don't see it. They don't experience it. And so putting
Yeah.
race, class, and gender together, I think, gets us further here. And of course, that's a theological principle too. If you think about Jesus's ministry, there was some identity moments here, right? Women, men, and so on. But there were always the class elements also. And unfortunately, most theology is not paying much attention to that these days.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the other I think challenges for kind of understanding religion in our contemporary context is the role truth plays in it. I think so much of modern religion, the moment the truth of a religion shows up, truth is correlated to probably some linguistic sign, right? Like some doctrine, and we either believe or don't believe this, and like our faith is oriented to believing this is true, and now marshaling reason or facts or history or whatever to legitimate the truth of it. And that ends up spilling large amounts of ink over ideas, falsifying something or being challenged to it. And now a belief gets fragilized, and then truth, when it goes to our material conditions, it gets covered over, and the truth of power and exploitation gets marginalized to a very different conversation. And I know that relationship of religion and truth and reinvigorating it is an important part of a largely liberationist perspective. So like, how would you start to kind of reframe that question of religion and its relationship to truth?
Right. So I think the problem with truth is that it's oftentimes used in the interest of empire, right? Somebody claims the truth, and then, of course, also at the same time, claims that they should not be questioned, they should not be challenged. And in that questioning and challenging, of course, weakens the truth. This is sort of the imperial notion of truth, capital T. In response to that, then, of course, you have all kinds of philosophies, or cultural approaches that say, well, truth is a lot more contextual and relative, which it is. I mean, we know this now, right? If you travel around the world, you realize how contextual things are. Of course, if you just walk out of your neighborhood into another neighborhood in the U.S., realities are so divided. You could learn the same thing, but of course, then everybody gets worried about relativism. This was, Pope John Paul II was really worried. I think Benedict XVI too. They're really worried about relativism, and assuming that either it's relativism or it's this capital T truth. Now, what I've argued, again, take it back to the Jesus movement, you have a different thing going on. I mean, Jesus talks about the truth several times. Of course, some of it is in the Gospel of John, where, historical critics say, well, did he really say it or not? The question here is not what exactly Jesus was saying, but what was the character of the movement. And I think the character of the movement was not to relativize all truth, but also to see clearly through the problems of the truth of the empire. And so when then Jesus in the Gospel of John says, "I am the truth, um, the way, the truth, and the life." One could either read that as an imperial statement, say everybody else is wrong, or one could read this as the truth that is emerging from the people in order to stay alive. This sort of life-giving truth that helps people fight the forces that are death-dealing. And so in John 8, of course, you have this famous passage where Jesus talks about the truth and the truth setting us free. So it's those kinds of things. Then truth, of course, does not get mattered into who has the best, in terms of who has the best definition, but in terms of what difference it makes. Does it liberate? Does it actually set people free from what? These
Mhm.
death-dealing idolatrous forces that basically, you know, create these tremendous divisions between rich and poor, north and south, and various political positions and so on. That is the problem. And so, having a truth that helps you change the world, that helps you actually transform things, is crucial. And that truth is never universal because it has to be figured out in the moment. It is valid in the moment. It is, of course, valid beyond the moment, but it has to be reclaimed. It always needs to be sort of re-engaging. But that's what Christianity was saying all these years too, right? If you really want to be in relationship with God, you have to build this relationship. You have to keep getting to know God. If you really want to be a faithful person, you have to figure out what discipleship means. You have to figure out what it actually means to walk with Jesus and all those kinds of things. This is that ongoing development of the small t truth, which I think is more relevant than ever because relativism, I doubt, will set us free.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned in that like a number of places, like the question of truth shows up in the Gospel of John, the way, the truth, and the life section. Jesus in chapter 8 says, "If you continue in my word, you're truly my disciples, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free." You get this conversation with Pilate, who asks, "What is truth?" And Jesus says, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over." And they're in all these ways. Like the moment truth becomes something that is problematic to the domination system of the day, you reread all those texts in a different way. But if truth in John is a legitimation structure for the domination system, then it's easy for to give an imperial reading of way, truth, life, all being under some nice structure of authority, or well, if you want the truth will set you free. And then, like, who holds the truth? Oh, well, the authority. But I find that the question, Jesus' own response to Caesar, to be rather enlightening, because it both problematizes, right, like the way in which truth gets enacted. Like, if my kingdom was of this world, the one you're in charge of, the domination system, then we would be fighting on the normal terms that things get fought on, and they would probably be fighting to keep me from getting handed over, and then, like, make me take your job, even though in the synoptics that's one of the temptations that Jesus rejects. But it's not as if his truth has nothing to say about it. But the way in which the people are being formed, the life that's at its that it's grounded, like when the way, the truth, and the life are oriented, it is a community of solidarity. It's a community that doesn't rule with top down violence and death. And I think that that just those different passages in John uh, can can be helpful at showing just how we've even learned to read blindly our own text. Right, the crescendo of the gospel right before the crucifixion and it is finished, which is the whole movement of John, is Jesus pointing out that 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 God's world, or the kingdom of God in the synoptics, or the way of life and truth, is one that problematizes um, our ally being Caesar in that age or any age.
So it's this community thing that you just mentioned, right? Building communities, and here communities of faith, right? Faith then doesn't believe, blind belief. It doesn't mean blind belief, but it means building this ongoing relationship. And in John 8, which you just quoted, Jesus talks about, if you continue in my word, right? And in,
Mm-hmm.
in our Protestant context, that usually means, you have to read the Bible a lot, which is part of it. But the Greek term there is logos, and that's much bigger than just, a word on a
Mm-hmm.
page. I mean, in the beginning of the Gospel of John, of course, the point is the logos becomes flesh, right? The word becomes flesh. So if you continue in this engaged way of life in a community, then the truth will set you free. So this is something that's quite fascinating, because it's also part of what's happened in history, right? How has resistance happened? Not usually in terms of huge revolutions, where history gets turned, but in terms of faithful communities that refuse to give in to the empire, faithful communities that live different ways of life, that build solidarity, that network. That's another history of religion and the church that we should be thinking about more. And of course, we'll be thinking about this in this upcoming course. But the whole point then about truth
Mm-hmm.
is not, I have it in my head or in a book. And I know a lot of people prefer this and that philosophy. That's great. There's certainly some truth to be had there too. But in the end, it's engaged truth. In the end, it's transformative truth that has to be verified in community and ultimately in history. So if it never does anything, yeah, then you have a nice philosophy, maybe a nice classroom session, but it doesn't really do anything. Fortunately, we have these examples where stuff is happening, and that goes through centuries. But what we want to talk about in these upcoming classes is really what's happening now. How is this happening now? And unfortunately, this is what doesn't get reported a lot. Everybody always looks at, well, how bad things are in the world. But let's talk about where this truth pops up and actually changes things.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we wrap up, I thought it would be good to let you say something about the class and the interviews. We've already recorded and edited interviews with theologians from across the globe, and one of the ways we even structured them, right, was there were a series of questions that you asked each of them, so that as you don't just listen and get to meet theologians from all over the globe that share this impulse for liberation, for a vision of the faith that has something to say and invite us to participate in and addressing these challenges that we're facing. But you also get to see how those questions get answered in a host of different contexts and with the wisdom of different people. So, like, when you think of uh, all of your your friends, different liberation theologians from across the globe, people to get to meet, and the kinds of questions that are there. Like, give everyone an idea of what's on the horizon.
So what we were trying to do is really find some of the leading current generation liberation theologians from around the world. So we're in every continent. We're talking with a really representative sample of people who are in this struggle. And the first question we've asked everybody is, what are we up against? Because that to me seems the really big question. And this is where, back to the culture war problem, I think we're not getting it. I mean, people in the US might think the problem is sort of a certain conservatism. Well, it's part of it. People might think the problem is, the incoming president, Donald Trump. Well, that's part of it. But it's usually a bigger thing. So we try to figure out what are some of these bigger issues we're trying to respond to. What are some of the issues that are really the life and death issues of our day? So as not to get stuck in our sort of narrow little
Mhm.
concepts, whether it's culture wars or any other sort of moralizing. I think moralizing is the thing that helps
I will
us to
come
get
move it
stuck.
once I get done.
So once we look at these
Like 5 minutes.
situations, once we look at these problems, we're now also talking about the solutions. Of course, this is the question, right? We want to look at the problems, not to complain and to bemoan them, but to see what are the solutions. So we're talking about various issues now. What are the theological themes? I mean, we talked a lot about problems today, but we really want to talk about good theological materials that can help human flourishing. So there's the theological component. What does it mean to talk about Jesus, the church, and so on, in ways that are flourishing? Then we also ask questions about, what has sustained you in the struggle, because some of these colleagues, myself included, have been in this struggle for a few decades. So we didn't start yesterday. We didn't just think about something that bogs us. The worst thing is always, when people think, with this incoming president in the United States, we're now living in an empire. I mean, we've lived in an imperial situation for a very long time, and we have to take that into account. So those are some of the questions, and then of course we also want to learn a little bit more about the various struggles as they go on around the globe. And the big question there is not just what's happening here and there, but where's the solidarity? I think this
Hmm.
is one of the biggest problems, I think, in some of the culture wars and the identity politics that goes with it, that we're not looking at solidarity anymore.
Yeah.
Solidarity doesn't mean we're all alike. We shouldn't look at our differences. Solidarity, what I call deep solidarity, is actually that which brings these various differences together for a better result, a better way out, a stronger response. And that's what the system is most worried about, right? The system doesn't worry about some people protesting here and there, or York and Tripp mouthing off about the problems of the world. The system gets worried when out of this thing solidarity emerges, where in the end, this is now much bigger than us. It's much bigger than just a couple of handful of people in the US, but it is global. And that's, again, the theological piece too, because we're, on the one hand, you have this idolatry that we were talking about, where God gets misused. We want to talk about solidarity where God self is putting God's self in solidarity with us. That's sort of the really ultimate question here. How is this bigger than any of us, and how is it so big that ultimately we can develop some new insights into the reality of God as well.
Hmm. Awesome. Well, I'm excited about the class. Everyone, when you sign up over at Truth in toughtimes.com, it's donation based, including zero. So, get your friends, go sign up. You'll be able to access the series of interviews in there, and then we'll have a outline of which ones we're focusing on each week, where you can send questions and such. Along with our conversation around your interests, we also want to make sure that when there are questions that come up about how different theologians in different contexts are voicing and reflecting on their faith, if you're coming from a context where you may not understand why they're framing it one way or whatnot, or how to hear a theologian where their church context is so different, they raise different questions, to let us know, so that we can hopefully help mediate learning from members of Christ's body other contexts, raising the challenges of people in Christ's body that often don't get a hearing in our own context. So,
And I think nobody has this material together the way we do, because asking these specific questions of people who are usually
mhm,
in their own struggles is pretty cool. I think there's something like a nuclear fusion going on, not just a matter of having these various voices in the room, but what happens when they come together. And of course, nuclear fusion. The point is producing energy. So the point here too is, a lot of people think, well, this is going to be really hard. Now we have to, be even working harder and all of that. But it's also energizing and life giving. That's the cool thing. And to see how this power of religion is at work around the world, I think could be pretty exciting. So we'll see
mhm.
what happens. I mean, we're learning as we go forward, but I'm excited.
All right. Well, thank you all that have joined us live, and those of you listening or watching later. Looking forward to continuing the conversation soon.